Hey, North Dakota, Rob Port here.
And I'm Chad Oban. You're invited to a special live recording of Plain Talk on Wednesday, February 19th at the Peacock Alley in beautiful downtown Bismarck.
We'll be interviewing special guests, reacting to the latest headlines, and answering questions from the audience.
Admission is free, so plan to arrive early to grab a great spot. The reporting kicks off at 6 p.m., and after the show, Rob and I will stick around if for some reason you want to meet us.
That's Wednesday, February 19th at Peacock Alley in Bismarck, starting at 6 p.m.
We'll see you there.
You'd expect to see the North Dakota oil and natural gas industry working at wells and processing facilities. What you might not know is our oil and gas industry also works to build roads, provide school funding, and even protect us from flooding by creating nearly 50,000 jobs statewide and generating billions of tax dollars annually to support our infrastructure, our great outdoors, and our schools. North Dakota Petroleum Foundation, advancing the possibilities.
You're listening to Plain Talk, the voice of North Dakota politics. I'm your host, Rob Port. If I sound distracted, it's because I've been busy covering this story all morning. I'm joined by my co-host, Chad Oban.
He's right of center, I'm left of center, both sides of the political spectrum.
I think it's cathartic. I think it's a necessary and proper debate. I'm glad we're having it.
And honestly, we have to do better.
Okay, I don't know why I'm getting blamed for this, right? Welcome to Plain Talk. Happy to be with you. You know, a couple of weeks ago, was it 2 weeks ago? Yeah, I think it was 2 weeks ago. We had on Brock Wall. He is a North Dakotan who is a member of the North Dakota Backcountry Hunters and Anglers. And he had some strong opinions about a debate North Dakota's been having for a few years now over chronic wasting disease and how the state of North Dakota should handle it. After that interview, I had a number of people reach out because there's a lot of people out there that are pretty passionate about this. They wanted the other side on the program, which I got to tell you was already the plan. And to have the other side on, a lot of people gave me the name of a gentleman by the name of Dusty Backer, who joins us on this episode, as does my co-host Jessica Bell, who is currently muted. Jessica, oh, okay, now she's unmuted herself. I was afraid. I was going to throw it to you, and you were going to be quiet. But Jay Bell sitting in for Chad Oban, who is told me he is not on vacation, although suspiciously he is in Las Vegas. So I don't know.
I don't know that I believe that, but either way, I'm happy to fill in for Chad.
I'm going to say that I do believe it because Chad has expressed a complete disinterest in gambling, much as I have. I don't like, for as popular, a lot of people like going to Las Vegas. Not for me. Not really my cup of tea.
Not a gambler, and I really don't enjoy Vegas all that much either. Unpopular opinion.
Not a gambler. I'm not a drinker. If there was a concert or something that was on, like a good, I would enjoy that. But for the most part, not my favorite place. But hey, to each their own. It's why
absolutely.
Anyway, back to chronic wasting disease. What a segue from Vegas to chronic wasting. We've had some testimony, some bills, and I think actually one of the bills is due on the Senate floor today. Senate Bill 2137, introduced by Senator Keith Boehm from District 33. The bill, it's a very simple bill. It says the department, meaning the North Dakota Fish and Game Department, may not adopt a rule or implement a policy prohibiting or restricting the use of supplemental feed on private property for hunting a big game animal. And Dusty, that really, there's a number of bills. There's this bill which basically inhibits the state's ability to regulate baiting, but there's other bills as well. But a lot of this, is it fair to say that a lot of this just boils down to a fundamental disagreement about how serious chronic wasting disease is as a risk to North Dakota's deer and elk wildlife population?
To a point, Rob. It's the SB 2137. It's always referred to as a baiting bill, but baiting, it's actually a hunting restriction bill because back in 2007, 2009, the people showed up to legislation in force and were able to keep the feeding of wildlife in the entire state of North Dakota. So our game and fish have only control of method of take, which is pulling the trigger over that feed in the entire state. So it's actually a hunting restriction, yet a lot of people want to refer to it as a baiting bill, and that's not even true. Anywhere in the state, people can supplemental feed, even in the restricted units, anywhere, anytime, any amount. We just can't hunt over it in those units. All in the name of CWD. So pulling the trigger, spread CWD. Couldn't be more from the truth.
Yeah, well, and I think that's a really good point, Dusty, because in my eyes, this issue isn't really about the all of the science behind this. It's a landowner rights issue. And the ability of the landowners to be able to utilize their land as they're the ones who are responsible for the wildlife and provide the feed, whether it's at a baiting location or otherwise. They're the ones who are taking care
You're
of
exactly
everything.
right, Jessica. It's the sportsmen and landowners who are actually the stewards of the land. And whether you're a landowner or sportsman on private property, we can feed deer all year long, feed birds, whatever, but they're just restricting us from hunting over that, all in the name of CWD, just pulling the trigger. With 50,000 deer tested, healthy harvested deer tested over 23 years, and there's only been one confirmed, that explains that's a problem right there. A confirmation of CWD, you have to see the myelin degrading inside the brain under the microscope. This is just a testing epidemic, and it's being used to take our rights away.
Is it? I mean, I guess I have to push back. And first of all, I'm trying to keep my bias against bait hunting out of this. I don't like it as a practice. I think it's unethical. I don't think it's sporting at all. I think the idea that it's about helping kids or disabled people hunt better is a canard. I see a bunch of old angry Karens who basically want to play a video game instead of engaging in hunting. I don't like it. That being said, I disagree with the idea that this is strictly a property right, because when I read the North Dakota Constitution and when I read North Dakota statute, it makes it pretty clear that our wildlife populations are a public resource. Now, they may obviously be on private land a lot of time, most of the time in North Dakota, most of our land is privately owned, but isn't that a public resource? And doesn't the state have an interest in protecting that, Dusty?
You make one good point there. So the deer are the people's deer. They are a public resource, and our game and fish are there to help manage the resource, not take our rights away with a federally funded narrative called chronic wasting disease. And they're getting a lot of funds from the narrative. And I like how you bring up the ethics part, Rob, because you can have that right. You can have that choice, ethics, because we have kept ethics out of this entire argument because we're only being restricted because of the CWD narrative. And people want to bring up ethics. It's not right. You know what? You have that choice, as so do I. And people want to make this all about baiting and putting feed down. And you know what? I haven't taken a deer over supplemental feed in over 10 years. It's not about baiting whatsoever. It's about we're losing our rights because of CWD. And that's why we've kept ethics out of it, because that's an individual choice. And we respect that.
Let me ask you this. Is chronic wasting disease real? I mean, does
Good
it
question,
exist?
Rob, and absolutely exists. It's extremely rare. It's identical to CJD, Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease in humans, which is a spongiform encephalopathy. It's holes in the brain. This is not a biology issue. This is a pathology issue. We've been working with pathologists all across the nation, and you have to see the myelin degrading under the microscope. It's all about pathology, not biology. And Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease is not contagious through bodily fluids. In fact, there's only 1 to 2 CJD cases per million people, and CWD is rare as well. These neurodegenerative diseases are extremely rare in animals, and the numbers show it.
So
Not even just North Dakota, 50,000 deer, healthy harvested deer tested, with one confirmation. The game officials say there's 3 or 4 clinical. Well, a deer can be spinning circles, emaciating on itself because of a zinc deficiency. And this information is in the Smithsonian Institute. Dr. Joel Wallach has done 32,000 autopsies on 454 species of animals using a electron microscope of 126,000 magnification, and has never seen a prion. And his book is in the Smithsonian Institute, and there's not one prion slide in that book. So we reached out to the Game and Fish. We've tried to sit down at the table with the Game and Fish, asking them for irrefutable evidence that it's contagious through bodily fluids and a slide of a prion. And they did not send me the irrefutable evidence is contagious. I had to go through the Board of Animal Health to get that information. And all that was inoculation studies meaning they're jamming saliva and brain material in these animals. And that's all they have, thousands and thousands and thousands of inoculation studies over 57 years since CWD has been labeled, and $1 billion spent, and they still cannot prove it's contagious through supplemental feed or bodily fluids. So then we asked for a Prion slide, and they sent us another 2021 research paper of 81,000 magnification. And the majority of the research paper's graphics, and if you look at the slides in that, they actually say fibrils. Well, fibrils are just elongated connective tissue, which meaning it's collagen, could be blood vessels, it's connective tissue. That's all the fibrils are. There is no such thing as a prion.
All right. Well, boy, there was a lot there. So what's happened in Wyoming? Because I've been reading news articles out of Wyoming from multiple sources, credible sources, academic sources, news media sources, talking about how chronic wasting disease has spread in their surveyed population. Elk and mule deer are the ones that I've read. I mean, is what's happening in Wyoming a hoax?
Colorado, Wyoming, Saskatchewan, that's all I ever hear about because they're just pushing the CWD propaganda. So it's just a testing epidemic. The more you test, the more you're going to pick up something in this test. These tests do not pick up a neurodegenerative disease. Like if you're not looking, and you can see a majority of the necropsies done are animals inside a pen that they're doing their own studies, and they're inoculating these animals and then say they have this disease. For all these tests in the wild in Colorado, Wyoming, Saskatchewan, I bet 99% of those are not necropsy to see the holes in the brain. The deer are disappearing off the landscape because of predation, winters, nutrient deficiencies. They'd never tell you the full truth for confirmation. Like I said, a deer could have many nutrient deficiencies and be clinical, spinning circles down to 70, 80, 90 pounds, emaciated. That does not mean it's CWD. That's why you have to do a necropsy, Rob, to see the myelin degrading in the brain.
So, and is the chronic wasting disease a debate? If is it something that is being leveraged and utilized in some way rather than to talk about a larger issue? My question, I guess, is the federal funding that you've mentioned. Where does that come from, and how does that trickle down, and what is that used for? And is it specifically for chronic wasting disease, or is it for monitoring all types of diseases in our herds? Can you talk a little bit about that federal funding piece?
There's been several CWD research and management acts the last several years, and the big one right now is for $420 million. It's HR 5608, and it specifically says in that federal package that the more positives defined, the more money they get. The harder they push, the more money they get. So in 2021, EHD, as you all know, it's a big topic, killed tens of thousands of deer, killed 98% of our herd along the Missouri River. And then in 22-23, the winter, east of 83, killed 50,000 deer from starvation because the game fish wouldn't help feed the deer. Well, these federal funds are only for CWD. There's nothing for EHD. And it's just surveillance and management. So our Game and Fish, they follow the AFWA document. In fact, all agencies are tied to this AFWA document, Associations of Fish and Wildlife. And in that document, it's 111 pages, but in that document, there's 162 words such as we believe, possibly, suggest, could be. Those are consensus words, and there is no consensus in science. And this is they're backed by robust science. And then the last page, page 87, there's a human dimension section in there. And our Game and Fish the last 3 years, Jessica, has gotten $265,000. And this is their grant. Our Game and Fish wrote this grant, Shifting Behaviors to Lower the Risk of CWD, a Multimedia Approach. Whose behaviors? Those are our behaviors, your behaviors, all because of one confirmation out of 50,000 deer tested. And all they do is test, which doesn't help the deer or sportsmen, restrict, doesn't help the deer or sportsmen, and call, which our Game and Fish has slaughtered 52 deer in the Williston Bottoms. All were negative, and they disposed of all the meat back in 2019 and don't want to talk about it. But now they let the hunters do it in the CWD zones like 3F2. They're actually adding tags, several tags, calling the deer after we just lost probably 100,000 plus deer from EHD in the winters, but there's no money attached to those diseases. So that's why I say it's a federally funded narrative. It's all coming from the top, and our Game of Fish is being told what to do. And all state agencies follow this same document. And there's also another document backed by robust science on our Game of Fish website. The first one's the AFWA. The second one's the AFWA statement, which says it indicates prions cause the disease. It doesn't say are. And majority of the scientists chose the prion hypothesis, where there's actually bacteria, virus, peer-reviewed when it comes to nutrition on there, but they chose the prion hypothesis. While our third one, backed by robust science on our Game of Fish website, is the prion hypothesis. And one of the 30 contributors and reviewers who wrote the AFWA, because the universities and agencies wrote their own document, wrote the AFWA document, one of those 30 wrote the prion hypothesis, and that's our third document on the Game of Fish website. And you can look at that document, and it's literally the prion hypothesis. After 57 years, $1 billion, and all these inoculation studies, it's still a hypothesis. Jamming brain material and saliva into these animals, making synthetic prions, that is gain of function research that has now been banned. And there's
So I heard two things there when it comes to the federal funding. One, that Game and Fish is rewarded for positive cases they find, and one that they applied for a grant to do some of these studies and this work. Is it both a grant and a per case kind of grant, or did I hear that correctly?
the Game of Fish have chose to wrote the grants, and the last two grants, one was in October of 22 to shift our behavior, so that's human dimensions for billboards, pamphlets. And the second one last fall, October of 24, was cultivating long-term engagement on a long-term issue. And majority of that is used for testing and human dimensions again. That's just pushing billboards, pushing the fear, NDSU bison games to do commercials during the games. Majority of the grants North Dakota is writing is for human dimensions to change our behaviors. Nothing for research, nothing for the deer or sportsman.
What so what's the end game here? Because you're alleging all that North Dakota state officials are intensely focused on chronic wasting disease, which you say is not a threat. And I agree. I mean, maybe it's not here yet. I guess one argument I would make in rebuttal to some of your arguments is that maybe we shouldn't wait until CWD is an epidemic here until we take measures to educate the public and to prevent it. But on the other side, you're also suggesting that they're completely callous towards other threats to our herd, that they don't care, that they're slaughtering and wasting the meat, and they're letting all these tens of thousands of deer die and everything because they don't care, because they're so focused on CWD. And I guess my mind as a reporter, because I covered this sort of stuff all the time, is where's the payoff then? I mean, what is motivating them? Why would they care? I mean, I don't. I mean, yeah, they're getting grants and stuff, but it's not like somebody has a contract or somebody's got a brother-in-law that's making a bunch of money. So why do you think they're doing all this, Dusty? What's your theory about that?
It's for power and control. Like our resources, EHD and starvation kill our deer, and that's what the sportsmen and landowners, stewards of the land.
So your contention is that state officials in North Dakota, in Wyoming, in Colorado, and I have an article on my browser right now from the University of Minnesota, all these different academics and officials and federal officials and everybody, they've all come together to use chronic wasting disease as a vehicle to just for their impulses to control humanity?
Well, let's just start with this. There's only been a handful of positive or confirmation cases in the nation, one in North Dakota, and there's been one proven in the state of Texas. And Texas has a 6 million deer population, and our agencies are slaughtering deer all in the name of CWD, with a couple cases in the nation, Rob. And this has been going on for 57 years.
So you're saying just a couple cases, because I'm reading an article out of Wyoming where they have certainly more than a couple cases. An article at I think it's yo.com, they're saying that 3/4 of one of their major mule deer herds, 3 out of 4 deer are infected with chronic wasting disease. That sounds like more than just a couple of cases.
Well, if you want to believe
country.
that the testing epidemic, I suppose you can read it like that. But until they're necropsied to see the myelin deteriorating in the brain, that's just a farce. That's this false information. If you want to believe the test, I mean, look at our beef market's been destroyed. Now they're trying to destroy our chicken market with H5N1 and the dairy market, the poultry market, and now they're coming after our wild game as well. I mean, 57 years, the numbers.
Why would they want to but why? But again, why do you think they're trying to destroy the? I mean, do you think they just hate chicken farmers? They just hate ranchers? Is that
You control the food. You control the.
why?
You control the
Why
food,
would?
Rob. You control the people.
Okay, so this is in your mind. They're using chronic wasting disease as a vehicle to control the
Well, it's
people.
not in my mind, but the numbers
One
actually show
vehicle.
it. It's actually facts. A couple cases in the nation, 57 years later, thousands and thousands and thousands of inoculation studies, and they can't even show us a prion exists or is contagious. If it were an epidemic, we would have no deer left. And we had a growing deer population up to 2021 until EHD came and the winters hit. Our tags were going up, and now our deer tags in North Dakota are going to be at all-time low. And they want to keep pushing human dimensions on the people of North Dakota, Rob, for one confirmation out of 50,000 healthy deer harvested or road kills. This is absolutely disgusting.
But prion diseases are real, right? I mean, we all remember the mad cow disease situation with our friends over in Great Britain. Was that all made up as well? Was that all part of this same
Neurodegenerative
plot?
diseases are real, but there is no such thing as a prion. Like, for instance, there's a podcast out there and from Jason Bartz. He's a 25-year prion biologist from Creighton University. The guy's never seen a prion. I listened to the podcast. He makes synthetic prion proteins, which is gain of function. And he says it's super hard to visualize a prion with a microscope. You need an electron microscope to do it. And prions are supposedly a little bigger than the double helix, he said. Well, Dr. Wallach's 126,000 electron microscope magnification, he saw the double helix, he saw mitochondria, he saw inside the RNA inner membranes, and has never seen a prion. And the game of fish have all the resources at their fingertips across the nation. And they send us a research paper from 2021, and it's fibrils. Like I said, it's connective tissue. And they have all the resources at their fingertips.
Let me ask you this question. Supposing I'm sorry, Jess, I am completely hogging this interview, but I am fascinated by it. Supposing, Dusty, that CWD was a real. I mean, just putting a pin in everything, because we're having a debate here about what North Dakota Game and Fish should be allowed to do to protect against something like chronic wasting disease. And one of the things they're allowed to do is they can't stop you from putting bait down, but they do have the legal authority to regulate hunting over bait. So what they do, my understanding, what they do now is if they detect CWD, they do a bait hunting ban within 25 miles of that detection. If chronic wasting disease was real, do you think that would be a reasonable reaction?
Absolutely not.
I mean, you don't think so? So even if CWD was everything that North Dakota Game and Fish says it is, you don't think that bait regulation would be reasonable?
No, because I can't fathom what they're saying. Because I'd like to back up a little bit, Rob, because you mentioned the units. Well, the Game and Fish. Let's just touch this topic a little bit. So you're right. When there's a detection in a unit, that unit is now you cannot hunt over supplemental feed in that unit, or if it's within the detection's within 25 miles of another unit, that unit is also restricted. Well, the Game and Fish changed their own surveillance map. They put the certain CWD zones are going to hit this part of the state for a year, and next year a different part of the state. They changed their own map to fit their narrative. Like, they changed their surveillance map. And there's two units, 2K1, 3B2, were to be on the restricted list 2 years ago, Rob, and they're still not on the list. And then there's 2E, 2D, 2C in the Northeast. They were to be on the restricted list last year, and they're still not on the list. So 3 units for 1 year, 2 units were supposed to be on 2 years ago. They're not even following their own science, their own CWD proclamation. Obviously, it's not that big an issue.
Speaking of game and fish, this was one of the things that I was contemplating while you're talking about, the control issue over the population. Um, and chronic wasting disease obviously is the hot topic in the capital right now. But I recall over the last decade there being other issues where, sportsmen and landowners have been really frustrated with game and fish over the years. Are there any other issues in front of the legislature this session that kind of fall into that same category that you were talking about with the control piece and can you speak to that just a little
Yeah,
bit?
the connection with the sportsmen, the landowners, and the game and fish is broken. And that's why you're seeing just more land get locked up across the state, because the people are not being heard, because the sportsmen landowners are not the ones sitting at the table with the game and fish. It's backcountry hunters and anglers. It's the Wildlife Federation. Those are the ones sitting at the table. And if you're at the Capitol, you can see they're the ones riding on the game and fish's coattails. We could have taken care of all this if the game and fish would bring us to the table. That's where the disconnect is. And we've been putting our information out there with the game and fish. We've been to the meetings. We're either dismissed or we're told you're welcome to your opinion, and we're still not brought to the table because we want to work on some EHD strategies. We want to work on keeping our deer alive in the wintertime and getting the connection back with the people and sportsmen and landowners of North Dakota. But as my knowledge to legislation, there's not anything that we're aware of other than these 3 CWD bills in legislation at this time.
So could you maybe explain a little bit? I know the Game and Fish goes out and holds, I think, chronic wasting disease sessions specifically with members of the public, but then they also hold other public meetings as well. Have you attended those over the past couple of years, and how have those conversations
Yeah,
gone?
so they have a spring advisory board meeting and a fall advisory board meeting. That's all they've done to my knowledge the last couple of years. But after the 2021 EHD outbreak, that following year, 2022, when all of our deer, majority of our deer died in our unit, our whitetails, they had 5 CWD meetings across the state, and we actually attended we attended 4 out of the 5. And they will have these magazines and telling us how bad CWD is, again, with one confirmation. And now 50,000 deer tested after we just lost our deer. And then that following winter, we lost 50,000 plus because of starvation. And then we've been to several advisory board meetings, but now they don't even want to talk about CWD. They don't want to bring it up. We've brought it up several times, and we're just dismissed, and you're welcome to your opinion.
Well, and one follow-up, I'm sorry, Rob, and then I'll kick you back over.
I did the same thing to you. So yeah.
We're gonna get into the swing of things here. Um, when you refer to we, Dusty, who is we? You said we attended those sessions. Do you have an organization that you belong to, or
Just
who
we
is
the
who is
people.
that?
And then we don't belong to any We don't belong to any
Got it.
organization.
Go ahead, Rob.
You had sent me a picture before this interview of a group of people sitting, and I've certainly seen them on the video feeds from the hearing rooms down in Bismarck. And you people wearing their all one color We the People shirts. And I'm wondering, because you were saying that, Game and Fish doesn't want to listen to you anymore. I've actually watched some of the live streams of some of the meetings that you've talked about where frankly the people wearing the shirts were abusive to state officials, yelling and shouting. And to hear you also talking about, CWD being this kind of, mechanism where they're just trying to control people, and it's part of this, sort of national or even international plot, to just control people or destroy, animal farming or what have you. And I'm just wondering, I mean, why should they engage with you? If you're accusing them of that, I can't imagine it would be easy for them to have a productive conversation to compromise, because Dusty, frankly, you don't sound like somebody who wants to compromise on this issue.
Wow, Rob. Let's just back up. People yelling with the orange shirts on to.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's on Facebook.
Well,
It's
people
all
can
over the
look at
place.
it, but there's no yelling on there. And you alone, Rob, just
Yeah,
labeled
well,
me as an activist when we're just merely questioning the Game and Fish's CWD narrative. So it's nice of you to point the
well, there's
finger.
nothing. I don't use I don't use that word pejoratively, but I'm just trying to think, like, the art of politics is finding a way for us all to get along on this issue. Now, there's a lot of people who believe that CWD is potentially a real threat and something that we want to keep out of our deer herd. And also the fact that, I mean, there's a lot of North Dakotans that make their living from livestock. So controlling animal diseases in our state isn't just important for recreation. It's important for, production agriculture as well. And I guess I'm just wondering, like, I mean, you're sort of accusing Game and Fish of doing, of plotting all these things. And do you think that's productive? I mean, how do we reach an accord here where we can, find the right balance between, what landowners and sportsmen want and protecting our animals?
Well, for one, Rob, there's no plotting here at all. This is CWD disease we're talking about. This is a CWD narrative that we've merely questioned, and the numbers don't show it. The hypocrisy doesn't show it. The hypothesis doesn't show it. We're not talking about all these other diseases. And there's been no yelling, to my knowledge, of people in the orange shirts whatsoever. There's a lot of people passionate out there, as ourselves, but we have no skin in the game.
Maybe it's in the eye of the beholder, but I've seen some very ugly things said about Jeb Williams, the head of North Dakota Game and Fish, on social media.
Well, you're right there with them then too, Rob.
I think that kind of
label me
stuff.
as an activist, when I'm just a passionate outdoorsman and live in Jessica Bell's district.
Lots of people are activists. Lots of people. I don't. Activist is not a dirty word. I'm sorry you take offense to that word, but I think activists are a good thing generally. It's a neutral term. Really, what's good or bad is what you're advocating for. But Dusty, I do appreciate you coming on. I know you were hesitant to coming on because clearly you and I do not agree on this issue. Jessica, I think, maybe agrees with you a little bit more than I do. But I do appreciate you coming on and taking some tough questions. And
I do appreciate having me on the show too, Rob. We can agree to disagree.
The cold cases you see at the Vault have captivated readers across our region for years. At the Vault podcast, our team of professional reporters takes you further into those stories with new interviews from family members, investigators, and experts. Check out The Vault at inforum.com/The Vault and subscribe to The Vault wherever you find your podcasts.
The work done by the thousands of North Dakota oil and natural gas workers is working to improve energy independence and national security. Working to make America more competitive around the world. And working to provide a better today and tomorrow for everyone in North Dakota and across our country. North Dakota Oil and Natural Gas works for our future. North Dakota Petroleum Foundation, advancing the possibilities.
Welcome back. Just finished up our interview with about chronic wasting disease with Dusty Backer, who I was just about to call an activist again. He doesn't want to be called an activist. I'm sorry.
Bad word.
I was not calling him an activist pejoratively. I think people who advocate for their point of view, I think they're activists. That's not a bad thing to be. So I call, if you look back at my writing, I call a lot of people activists. Who's also an activist on property taxes is, I'm so good at these segues.
Ooh, I love it.
Representative Ben Koppelman is an activist on all sorts of issues. One of the issues we're going to be talking about is property taxes. Ben, I hope you don't mind me calling you an activist.
No, it's great to be on with you and a former activist that I used to serve with. So
Yeah, another activist. Maybe I'm an activist too, right? I'm always telling people what I think.
I think the key word is that we're all active. I think that's what we want to celebrate out of that term. So
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's a really good thing to do. Be involved in government. Active, my
agree.
friend. I love it.
When I use it, it's a positive thing. It's better than sitting on your couch and just complaining about everything. That's not activism. I don't know what that is. Property taxes, Ben. We came into this session. We had a debate. I know we talked with you, back before the session. I think back when Measure 4 was still in play. Obviously, we know what happened with that bill now. It got defeated pretty soundly by the voters. You at the time were proposing an alternative, looking at taxing square footage. But now legislative session is going. The governor obviously has made a lot of headlines because he's the governor and he's put his plan on the table. We know what that is. It's essentially a buy down of property taxes over time. using revenues from the legacy fund by expanding the primary residence tax credit that's already existed, right? Hopefully you filed, if you own a home in North Dakota, hopefully you filed and got $500 for the last 2 years. But if you didn't, you should have.
I did. It took me like less than 30 seconds this last time.
No,
Like, it was so fast.
Tax Commissioner Brian, right? They deserve a lot of credit. That was a very easy, well executed program. Well done on them. Governor Armstrong's plan basically expands that, and then probably the more controversial over the last couple of weeks is a 3% cap on communities to basically so that they don't grow property taxes to outpace the credit. So 3% tax, although unused portions of the cap can be rolled over for 5 years, and also locals can this part doesn't get mentioned enough. Locals can always go to the voters and ask them to exceed the cap in any given if they want to put it on the ballot and the voters say yes, hey, will the people. But Ben, you have an alternative plan. So I'm just gonna throw it to you rather than try to describe it myself. I'm gonna let you just what is your plan? What is your alternative to the governor's plan?
Well, first, let me start with kind of segueing from what we talked about the last time. The converting away from valuation to square feet. That plan is still out there. I worked with Representative Nathan Tolman, and he introduced that bill so that we didn't both have one. He actually introduced my language. But that's kind of a standalone piece. That's the reform piece. I've got this new pitch that I call the 3 R's that I think need to be done in this order, which is the reform, it's the restrain, and it's the relief. So the reform piece is getting rid of valuation. There's only one bill that does that. And that's compatible with the governor's plan or other plans that are out there for relief. The second piece is the restrain piece. That's where you hit on cap. And the cap in the governor's plan, I agree with pretty strongly. I have a couple of tweaks I would suggest, but that's an identical plan to what the governor and I discussed when we were in Fargo back in October, the then candidate for governor. And so I'm kind of, thrilled and honored that he would take that idea and put it in his plan. So he and I agree on that. I did introduce a bill that's very similar to that cap, albeit in a separate bill. And we'll see what the tax committee does with that. But I could be satisfied with the governor's cap. I also agree with something that the governor chose to do, which I've been saying for nearly a year, which is that the best legacy that we can offer out of legacy fund earnings is affordable home ownership. And that I thought that all of the property tax relief that we offer should come out of legacy fund earnings. And the governor spelled out a path to how we can get there. It's not day one because we kind of hamstrung the earnings with other things like bonding for buildings and infrastructure, things of that nature. But in the long term, his plan would get there. And I'm totally on board with his funding scheme, and his funding scheme would work with this other relief plan.
And so just to be clear, his funding scheme is using a portion of the legacy fund's earnings. Now, and I think people get confused about this because when you say you're going to use the legacy fund, they think we're going to be spending down the principal. You have to think of the legacy fund as basically its own revenue source. It's become like the income tax or the sales tax or what have you. Yes, oil tax revenues are flowing into the legacy fund. Those revenues are getting invested, and like any investment, it grows, and then it produces revenues that we can spend. And so he's using a portion of those revenues that currently flow into the SIF fund and the general fund. He's using those to fund his project. I just wanted to be clear on what that was.
Well, and the listeners or viewers can think of that as interest. When you get interest on your checking account, that's what you're spending for this relief. It's on this big checking account we call the legacy fund. So I agree with his funding source and with his cap plan. Where I differ in opinion is on the relief piece, which is the third R of my 3R plan. And the relief piece, I'm pretty far apart with him. Part of the reason I'm far apart is if we don't make the relief hit everybody at their house, at their primary residence, I believe we're going to set ourselves up for another measure. And when you look at the plan the governor's laid out, he's saying, let's take the $500 that everybody got and make it $1,500. So it's a net $1,000 or $1,050, I think it actually is, of new money to every homeowner. He does have a portion of his plan that does increase the eligibility for those over 65 to get into the homestead tax credit plan. And I believe the net new, if you want to say new relief of his piece is about $409 million. That's not the total cost, but when you net it out from what we would otherwise spend to continue, I think his is in the neighborhood of $409 million. So I introduced a bill, which is House Bill 1390, which says, I don't want to do just a flat dollar amount and essentially zero out some people's taxes while giving others a 10% break. I'd rather have something that's more equitable. So I had proposed a 70% reduction in every primary residence property tax liability. Now that came in at a net dollar amount that was about 120, 130 million more than what the governor had proposed. And I believe we can afford it. But if the decision is we can't afford it, that same 70% plan can be scaled down to 60%. And then it's within 10 or $20 million of the governor's plan. Very similar money at that point. So the question that I'm kind of asking everybody is, would you rather have a 60% reduction in your tax liability for everybody, or you want another $1,000? And I can, explain this on different price houses, how this makes sense. And also how the governor's plan is going to leave most of our urban areas, or if we can call anything in North Dakota urban, our big 10 cities are going to do much worse with the governor's plan than with my plan. And I feel that those are going to be the people that aren't satisfied, that then would be the sort of ammunition for another measure. And imagine if we had another measure that was more simply tailored, that wasn't eliminating property tax, but instead says, hey, we're just going to eliminate it for all primary residents. Now that would probably be less than $1 billion plan, right?
I might have voted for that plan.
That's what I'm saying. So don't think that Measure 4 is coming back if we don't do this. Think of something that's much more tailored and can pass. Because remember, Measure 4 had a legislative punitive piece to it. It wasn't just about the fairness of property tax I want to pay in my house. But if it comes back again, I really believe it'll be done better in such a way that would probably pass and would probably be directed at primary residents.
Taking the percentage approach instead of just the flat fee approach, does that impact like low income residents in a different way than higher income residents? How does that percentage play into like who gets to zero out on their taxes first? How does that work with the switch to a percent?
Okay, well, first of all, let me preface it by there's a hold harmless in this bill for anybody that got the $500 now and essentially has zero tax liability. Say they own a trailer home and it's less than $500. They can keep the $500 plan. They don't have to switch over to 60 or 70% plan. Okay, so they're held harmless. Anybody that's on the veterans credit or over 65 homestead credit, they can stay on that plan. Anybody that gets the farm home exemption and doesn't pay any on their own, they can stay on that. So none of those people are affected. So anybody that nobody's going to do worse under my plan tomorrow than they're doing today. Okay. But if we say, how about the proposal of the governor, where the governor says, I'm going to give another $1,000 to everybody versus the 60% plan, where are the winners and losers? And I believe that those that have a house that's worth less than $175,000 will do nominally better on the governor's plan. But keep in mind, when I say nominally, I'm saying maybe $100, $150. We're not talking thousands of dollars better. But if you put the shoe on the other foot and say, well, what about, let's look at a $200,000 house. At $200,000 house, if you assume the taxes I pay in West Fargo, I'm just using that as a metric, which is about 1.3%. It's a little on the higher end of taxation around the state, but it's not uncommon in our bigger cities to be north of 1%. And so in West Fargo, that $200,000 house would pay a total of $2,600 in tax. And under the 60% plan would get $1,560 relief. Now you can compare that to the $1,550 the governor's plan is offering. So you could say in West Fargo, $200,000 is about the break even, where it's a coin flip. But that's the low end of housing in West Fargo or Cass County. There's some below that, but limited. So then everybody that does better, let's just take a $300,000 house. Well, now a $300,000 house would get a total of $1,550 from the governor's plan, 1,000 new. But on the 60% plan, they get $2,304. And then you can imagine everybody above that continues on. So if you look at the taxation on a $500,000 house, which again is not that nice in West Fargo compared to what many of the people across the state might think, that individual would get almost $4,000 in relief versus $1,500. So the idea is that everybody should get to zero together. Now, those that are already zeroed out on these other plans, we're not touching them, but on the new plan, everybody should get to zero together, because that's what gets us all having stake or skin in the game to want to continue this program to zero. But if we do what we did with income tax and we zero out the bottom 50, 55% of taxpayers, there's no more motivation to finish the job. And then that's where you lead to a measure. The other thing is a measure is 2 years out, in my view. A measure is not 4 or 8 or 12 years out. So when the governor says, here's where we'll be at the end of 2 more biennia, I don't think we get to that. I think that a narrow measure happens before that. And so in my district, just to use it as an example, I see $200,000 to $700,000 to be the range of houses in kind of Fargo, West Fargo, particularly my district. So the average person in my district would probably get like less than a 20% tax reduction while other people are getting 100. That's not going to be enough to say, no, I'll stay home and when the measure comes out.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
What did you say the price tag difference was? Because as you got me thinking about that increased benefit for some of those homeowners that have higher valued homes, that adds up pretty fast. How many dollars we talking about there?
Well, the numbers that I ran through, and I asked the tax commissioner for some data to try to make sure I was doing it right. I mean, these are not his numbers exactly, but they're with his data. But the benefit, the new dollars, he calls it the new benefit. We're talking of the governor's plan is $409 million, which I would call that the new dollar cost, and mine's $430 by our calculation. So we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars of total relief, some of which we're already funding, some of which is new money. We're talking a difference of about $20 million, maybe something like that, or 23.
Can't get the math to math, but I'll think about it while
Yep.
Rob asks his next question.
But, all right.
So the selling point on your plan over the governor's plan is it gets more relief faster.
Well, and a higher percentage of relief to more people. Because giving 100% of relief, let's just kind of figure out what's going to happen. Take out the top, 8 to 10 largest cities in the state, and you're going to give most people outside of that nearly 100% relief. We'll say probably 70 to 100% relief under the governor's plan. But you go into the 8 to 10 biggest cities, and you're going to give about 10% of the people, maybe 20 on the high end, 100% relief. But then it's quickly going to wane as you get into the average person in those cities, because you just don't have houses that are certainly not, that are less than 200,000 in a lot of those cities.
My home, and I hope I'm not giving up too much about my home, my last property tax bill was $5,400. So, I mean, basically with the governor's plan, that gets me down to about 4,000. I would tell you, I would be delighted by getting that. I mean, that's a pretty substantial reduction in my property tax bill. I mean, my home, I don't live in a mansion, but it's, I think mine's a pretty comparable home. I think that I would be pretty happy with that relief. Let me ask you this though. One thing that I really liked, and I thought the governor made in private conversations, and also when we interviewed him here on Plain Talk, he made a really interesting point that I hadn't thought of, which is that the legislature's past efforts to buy down property taxes has created sort of what Congress faces in Washington, D.C. with the non-discretionary spending, where we've created, and I just wrote an article about it this week, where roughly half of our general fund spending now is quote unquote tax relief. And in fact, I got a text from our state treasurer that said that a number could probably be even higher if we looped in some infrastructure spending and things like that. I just kind of narrowed it to just ongoing property tax relief spending it's a little more, about 26% of general fund spending. So what the governor says is that's like non-discretionary spending, where it's like the legislature kind of can't touch that, right? Because if they touch it, it's going to immediately hit property taxes and people are going to be upset about it. So his plan shifts the burden for that over time out of the general fund and onto these legacy fund earnings. Where basically we create one revenue stream that's attacking everybody's property tax bill, and then over a decade. And kind of your complaint is that timeline's too long and we're going to end up with another ballot measure. That's what I hear you saying. What does your plan do, though, about that sort of non-discretionary, if that's the right term for it, that non-discretionary funding problem in the general fund?
Well, generally, property tax relief bills have not necessarily had funding sources in them. That's a lot of times been done through appropriations. And I'm not sure if the governor's plan in House Bill 1176 actually has that sourcing in it, or if that's just kind of his overall view of things. But I agree.
I think I know that's his philosophy. I guess I didn't look to see if it was specifically in the bill.
Well, I agree with his philosophy entirely, and his philosophy is entirely compatible with the bill that I'm proposing. Now, if you're going to take the governor's approach to really make it meaningful, I think you have to add 2 or 300 million to it to really get to hitting the sweet spot. Whereas if you take my approach and scale it to 60, you can spend what, like I said, 20 some $1 million more, which is a fairly small amount in by comparison. But you can spend $20 million more and you can make that hit that sweet spot right away and still pay for it over time and move the liability over to the legacy fund earnings and kind of, do what the governor is suggesting and still cap the local governments like the governor is suggesting as well. It's just a matter of where do you spend your 400 and some odd million, and do you hit a sweet spot with it or not?
Yeah, I'm still struggling with the maths over here, trying to think about if Rob has an average home. We'll call it that. I don't know that you use those exact words, but an
We're very average. Although I did paint my house red, so we're not very average in that.
Well, you probably got taxed more for that, but let's
Yeah, you
move
think
on.
so? Yeah, I could be. I could be. I wouldn't let him in my house though. To
Yeah.
get the inside. So that's all they had to go on is, well, this is a big, beautiful red house.
No, beautiful red house. So Rob's got an average beautiful red house. I have a very similar house. My property tax bill is a lot lower than yours, so I guess I'll put a plug in for Beulah. They're doing a great job with
Hey, maybe
property.
maybe I need to move.
But 60% of Rob's bill or Rob's property tax bill is $3,000. And otherwise it would be, 1,500, which is half of that. And so I when you're talking about those bigger numbers or average and above average homes, you're adding stuff up there really fast. And when you're cutting it off the lower end, that's 60% of $100,000 house. I just don't see how those numbers that could only be $20 million. So I'm still stuck there on what that fiscal note. Do you have a fiscal note yet on that bill?
They were supposed to apply amendments to the bill in tax committee, but they hadn't applied them as of the end of the day Monday. Until we get the proper scoring, we won't know. Now that the total plan at 70% was about 723 million. But again, they need the amendments to get the proper fiscal note. I think the fiscal note came in at like 540 million or something, but it was sunsetting the homestead tax credit for veterans and seniors. And that was never the intent of the bill. So they had to get that corrected. But I believe the true cost at 70% is about 730 million. So it's just over 100 million per 10% that you're doing it. So the total cost of 60 million is like, I don't know, like 618 or something. But then what you do is you take off the cost of what we're already spending on the $500 because that's getting converted over. And that I believe is 103 million per year, something like that. And then there's some other areas where we don't have to duplicate because people are better off with this plan than their old plan. So they come off the homestead tax credit. So that's how you get down to the net number by making all those things work. But again, I think where the hard thing to wrap your head around is if you have, let's just say you have 60% of the state that gets $200 less on my plan or something like that, or $100 less on my plan, you add it up and say, okay, now we're going to apply that to how Rob does better in his house. I think it's just a numbers game of how many houses by percentage are there across the state that are over 200,000 or under 200,000. But yeah, the thing that the governor's plan really misses the mark on is trying to hit people in different demographic groups, meaning urban versus rural, big town versus small town versus country. How does that all look compared to each other? And it doesn't really matter if you miss one group or the other group. If you miss a large component, then you're going to have problems holding off a measure. And we have 20% of the population that lives in Cass County alone. And then you factor in the other counties where the large cities are. And I bet you that total population in large cities that are going to do worse on the governor's plan might make up 50% of the population of the state. I don't know. And, but it's a serious chunk of the state that are doing worse. And I believe that's where all the scuttlebutt with a measure is going to get riled up in one of those cities. I think Minot was kind of the breeding ground of that this time, but I think it could be Fargo. It could be West Fargo. And like Rob said, if somebody does a smart measure like I just proposed, it'll pass. And that's why I think, and it may not be the best way to go. But anyway, that's my pitch. I just really think that I've shared it with the governor. I've shared with him my concerns. I think now it's just about trying to get the word out there to see what the voters would rather see. And that's my purpose to doing interviews like this.
Well, I know Kelly. Kelly's been very open about the idea that he borrowed idea. Like he almost didn't even want to take credit. We keep calling it the governor's plan because he announced it, I guess. But he's freely said, I borrowed things from other people. Really the only unique thing in his mind was the idea of getting what we've, sort of the burden of the property tax relief that the legislature, which has been ineffective. That's a whole other podcast, but getting that out of the general fund and into that was kind of his unique innovation, but he's freely admitted. One thing though, when I'm listening to your plan, it sounds, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds a little complicated because people who want to stay with the current $500 a year credit, you said they can make a choice and they could stay there. People who are maybe getting some of these other homestead for veterans or what have you, they can make choices. That sounds like I don't want my property tax bill to be, I just did my income taxes last night. I don't want it to be like doing my income taxes where I got to go through and answer a bunch of questions. Is there a risk here that you're making things too complicated?
Well, maybe I made it too complicated in the explanation just for the sake of trying to say that we're not harming people.
Maybe I misunderstood you.
No, I was actually going to ask. I was trying to I was trying to not fall into like old legislator just like, how is this going to work administratively, Representative Koppelman? Because it does sound complicated to carve this group out and this group out and this group out for, as you're trying to reduce property taxes, increasing that burden on administration in the background. But I didn't want to be.
I think it's actually following a similar suggestion in the governor's plan, and that is that you register one time. At least this is how mine works. You register one time as a homestead, as a primary residence, essentially, and you never have to register again. If you sell your property and the property tax statement never comes in Ben Koppelman's name again, well, obviously they're not going to continue to give a credit because you can't give a credit on something you don't own. Now, if I decide to move to Minnesota and keep my house in North Dakota not as a primary resident, and I still collect the credit, that's on me, and I may have to pay that money back because that's not the right thing. But people aren't going to have to re-up this every year. It'll actually be easier in the long term than what Rob said was very easy this year to get the $500. As far as those people that stay in the kind of the hold harmless section, even if they file they have to file their claim, I believe, every year to get the homestead tax exemption for seniors or for disabled veterans. So if they do better on my plan, then they wouldn't have to do it. Otherwise, they would continue to do what they're doing, but they're not going to have to sort this all out. Like, how am I doing this year versus next year? I think it'll be evident right away who's best off staying in the plan they're in or not. And I believe the tax commissioner's office has a fairly healthy budget in there for helping taxpayers decipher that. And the governor's plan is going to have to decipher that too, because he keeps those same programs in place.
One thing whether it's the governor's plan or your plan, we're going to have to implement, because right now the primary residence classification or category doesn't exist. So that's something and I'm kind of curious about how we're going to enforce that over time. Where somebody who, living in Minot or Beulah, and maybe they retired to Arizona and now they're living in Arizona full time and their residence in North Dakota is no longer their primary residence. How are we going to enforce that? Like, how are we going to detect when that happens? That seems to me an administrative quandary.
Well, and I don't know if I have the silver bullet for enforcement, like trying to catch the scammer, but my bill specifically has language that says that if you are not qualified for this, if you claim any sort of a primary residence credit or homestead credit in another state. So if, now we're not going to count days on their cell phone records as to were they in Arizona or North Dakota. At least that's not my intent. But
it's part of the problem. Our residency requirements are pretty loosey-goosey to begin with.
Well, and that's going to have that same problem with any of the plans. I mean, the Louser plan, which I don't know think's the way to go, but that plan creates an actual classification for primary resident. Whereas the governor's plan and my plan both are basically have like you sign up as a primary resident and then you're considered that as your primary residence until you change it. But again, my plan does have the rule where you can't claim it in two states. I don't know if the governor's plan has that rule.
Well, I'm actually just really excited. We're all having this conversation. During my time in the legislature, we tried a bunch of transparency issues. You were there, Representative Koppelman. things that obviously have not worked up to this point. It has not provided the reform and relief that we need. And I'm just glad that we're to the point here where we're debating, well, do we want a flat rate or do we want a percentage rate? What kind of relief are we giving the citizens? So I'm just really grateful we're here having this conversation and have gotten to this point, because it's taken a really long time to get here, where everybody's at the table finally saying, yes, we have to do this. Because the amount of times, and I love my friends at Association of Counties, but the amount of times that they stood in the hallway and shook their finger at me for what I was trying to do are numerous. And so this is a great conversation.
I'm sorry. Well, I'm glad that caps are kind of on rails too. That's been kind of the bone of contention. And I'm sorry, we are painted into a corner. The legislature has one tool to control local spending, and that's a cap. So, the locals have had their shot over the last 20 years. We've been debating this to keep spending in line on their own. Now they're going to get a cap, and I'm enthusiastic.
Well, and one thing to keep in mind about this cap that we're doing, this cap is a cap on how much revenue they can get from property tax. It's not a budgetary cap. And many cities only get between 40 and 60% of their tax revenue, especially the bigger ones, from property tax. So the cap, that's why I say the cap's not the only thing we got to do. It's the restraint piece. It's not really the reform piece. Because what really did us in over all these years that Jess and I had served together and so on, was the fact that valuation was the item that was the end around that ate up the relief. And so if we don't take care of the valuation, what's going to happen is we'll take care of a portion of the problem, but we'll still have some backsliding because of the valuation, because there's several things that don't fall into this. For example, when they levy for, let's just say they levy to pay back a bond. Let's use a school as an example. So if the debt service is $1 million for that year, they're going to take all the valuation and divide it out to figure out how many mills they need to pay that $1 million. Well, if you're talking about what's the effect of the individual taxpayer, you have one taxpayer's property going up by, let's say, 20 or 25%, another goes up by 3%, or maybe even stays flat. That's going to shift the deck chairs around on who pays what for the same school that they both voted on, even from last year. And so people think that somehow this is going to yield a 3% limit in how much the property taxes can go up. And that's not going to work unless you also take valuation off the table.
Ben, thanks for your time.
Thank you very much for having me.
Hey friends, we've got a new way for you to participate in the show. You can now call us or text us with your questions, comments, or anything you want us to discuss on Plain Talk. Just give us a call or shoot us a text message at 701-587-3141. That's 701-587-3141. It's super easy. Leave your message, tell us your name and where you're from, and we might feature it on an upcoming episode.
Thanks for listening to Plain Talk. Now let's get back to today's episode.
Well, wrapping the show up, 2 great interviews, I thought. Chronic wasting disease. I think are a little more skeptical of Game and Fish's regulation than I am, I guess.
I love how Dusty was like, I'm in her district. I was like, well, not anymore, sir. I mean, we do live in the same one, but I dealt with so many of these Game and Fish issues. I mean, you start talking about the micromanagement of regulating the ability of ranchers to shoot a coyote in the middle of the night using night vision goggles. And I mean, the way that Game and Fish would go about trying to get around legislation that I introduced and passed and got signed by the governor was just really intriguing to watch, quite honestly. So what I was trying to get at with my questions is I understand how paranoid and frustrated people are with Game and Fish, because I have seen it with my own eyes. I've dealt with it with those in my district when I served, and it can be incredibly frustrating. So, and then of course I always fall on the landowner side. I get it. I got a little loopy when you started talking about all the science behind chronic wasting disease. That's not an argument that I'm particularly interested in. So I get the sentiment, and I support the sentiment of being frustrated with Game and Fish and being a landowner and being able to do what you want on your own property. But you start getting into that, like chronic wasting disease basically doesn't exist, or you can't. I oof. I
Well, I think he said CWD is real, but he said prions don't exist, which is a distinction I'm not sure I'm understanding.
yeah.
Um, you know, prion prion diseases exist. One thing that was really fascinating is during the committee testimony is yes, CWD, we've been aware of it for a long time, but some of the testing and stuff is still relatively new. I mean, science is not a static thing. We are developing all the time. I mean, for instance, like Representative Porter, who chairs the committee that over the hearing, obviously has a medical background, working as a uh,
EP.
EMT. I don't know why my mind blanked on that. Working as an EMT. So he has a medical background, and one thing he was saying is like, um, multiple sclerosis, it's some of these other things, cystic fibrosis. I mean, you would be surprised for as long as we've known about them, how relatively new some of the testing and things are about it. So I don't know. I just, uh, if you want, I feel like there's a culture war element to this when I see them wearing their "We the People" shirts and everything.
Absolutely. When I asked who we was and he said we the people, I was like, oh, yep. I
Well,
mean,
I'm
it's all in
I'm the
that
people too.
category.
I'm all people, and I disagree with. But the thing about that is I think there is maybe some righteous frustration with Game and Fish, which you alluded to,
Yes.
and I
Yes.
think they've
I
allowed
think even
whatever.
Game Fish would admit that, honestly.
I think maybe Game and Fish could do a better job with working with some landowners,
And I hope they do. I
although
really
that's
do.
gotta go both ways because landowners got to be able to work with Game and Fish too.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely they will.
for whatever reason, I think they've picked this CWD issue as like the hill they're gonna die on.
Yes, it seems that way to me.
And maybe they even have enough velocity. I mean, maybe this is gonna pass. I just don't know that good policy is made this way because I look at what's happening in Wyoming. That's real. I look at what's happening in Colorado. That's real. Like I don't this idea that that there's this cabal of people from the federal government over in Great Britain, all across that have chosen this vehicle. I got to tell you, if they want to control people, there are easier ways to do it than this. Uh,
I
I,
think
I just
I can't disagree with you there. I
just
cannot.
fundamental disagreement. I think it's just kind of a tale as old as time. Is when you're a regulator, which people in Game and Fish, I think that's a term we could use for them. When you're a regulator, you have a hammer, and everything starts looking like a nail. And that's something we do have to guard against. On the other hand, sometimes the thing really is a nail, and we really do have to hammer it.
Yep.
I don't know. Um, Representative Koppelman's proposal. I'm glad he put the proposal forward.
Me
Um,
too.
because I think this is a worthwhile debate, and that was something the governor was very clear when he was on the show. I mean, he's open to ideas. Like here's a fixer upper. Let's all get together and figure out, what we're gonna do. The one part of his plan is it does seem a little complicated to me, and I realize like he did kind of explain it at the end, where he's saying, well, I mean, basically you're gonna you opt into all the things you're gonna opt into, and then you're set. And I guess that makes sense. But I don't know. I guess what I like the governor's plan is it's elegant. I think if I'm understanding, I don't want to put words in Representative Koppelman's mouth. I think his frustration is it doesn't get the relief out fast enough in his
Yeah,
mind.
I think that was what he was trying to get to as well, and I've contemplated that a lot because yes, you do always have this threat of a measure kind of hanging over our heads. I I don't worry about that so much, especially in this next cycle, because property tax is number one on everybody up in that bill. I was up in the building this morning. It is number one on everybody's minds. It was uttered out of, I wasn't up there to talk about property taxes, but it was the first thing that everybody brought up this morning. And so I know it's first thing on their mind. They're going to do reform and relief and restraint in a way that is meaningful, and having so I think that debate, and I know they'll get results out of that, is going to appease people in a way that I think keeps any large type of bad reform from going on the ballot again. And I think that having a conversation about how you get there, whether that's a percentage threshold or a flat fee, or it's all going to provide the amount of relief and reform that everybody was looking for. Because we're debating the small potatoes now, not the big potatoes, not the like you can really get into the weeds on property taxes, which I will avoid because everyone will fall asleep. But
I do like that the governor's plan is elegant. One thing I wish I'd asked Representative Koppelman is because his plan is based on a percentage, but then we were also talking about what valuations can do, right? Because I think that's absolutely been a huge driver. Is all of a sudden my property tax bill goes up significantly because the government says my property's worth more. It's a tax on unrealized gain because just because my house is worth $50,000 more, allegedly, I don't have $50,000 more in the bank. So I
And I
think
have
that's
to have to
great.
soapbox there because that's not how the system is structured. And this was the thing I said over and over and over again when I chaired the tax committee, that just because your valuation goes up does not mean functionally with how the formula works that your property tax should go up. That is not how the formula works.
If that's
Local
how it,
governments
if
should
that's what
set their
happened.
budget. That is what happens. Yes, but local governments should be setting their budget, working within the budget. If your valuation goes up, it's still just a percentage of the taxable value of your house that go into the mill. I I also was advocating for the elimination of the mill, so which I continue to, no one's listening, but I continue to advocate for the elimination of the mill because it's complicated.
I never hear the word mill again. Yeah, they've got to, they can work and we should be talking about percentages and dollars. But we don't. We talk about mills, and it's super confusing for everybody. But I do. I guess I like the governor's plan because it seems very elegant to me. It seems more straightforward, and I do worry, like if we leave, and in fairness, Representative Koppelman has also proposed basically doing away with valuations and taxing something more static, like square footage, which
That's a whole different debate. Yeah.
a whole different debate. But if we still had value, if we have his plan based on percentages plus valuations, if you see a valuation spike, then the state's cost of covering that nut, that percentage of relief that he's talking about, goes up dramatically. So we're kind of like, and the governor's plan doesn't have that variable because it's just a straight dollar amount that grows over time with the legacy fund coupled with a cap to keep local spending in line. Um, I think that's a more elegant solution, but again, there's many paths. I'm glad he brought it forward. I think it's interesting. What did you think about some of the locals coming out swinging against the cap? I was laughing.
Was the
Uh,
least surprising thing that has, I think, ever happened in the North Dakota Capitol building.
I was kind of laughing because obviously my community was one. I mean, our city council passed the commission, and
Yeah.
the guy leading the charge on it, Mike Blessum, who's you know
Bless him. Just bless him.
politically is, rails all the time about out of control spending and everything, has advocated for a cap on state spending, has advocated, and in fact, there's a bill that said that apparently was put in at his behest by Representative Wolf out of Minot here. And I mean, he's out there pushing, like, he doesn't want his spending capped. And I trotted out a Franz Kafka quote about how every revolution ends this way. They get power, and then it's meet the same boss, same as the old boss. Although that's not the Kafka quote. The Kafka quote was about how revolutions dry up and just leave behind the slime of new bureaucracy.
I I find it fascinating that people can live through the campaign that we lived through on property taxes over this past year and be so impassioned about the measure and defeating the measure, and then come in and say no to the one thing that has been threatened for the past decade over their budgets. Like eh, if they haven't found a thing that works other than caps up to this point that they're comfortable with, like you got to just face the music here, folks. We've got something has to be done. And like you said earlier, it has not happened at the local level in all circumstances. Now, there are definitely some local jurisdictions that have not, raised taxes, that have worked to lower taxes, that have not gamed the system to try and get around the valuation methodology with the mills. But if you're doing that, you very likely can operate within that the cap level that they're proposing. And Ben made a good point. The cap being on the actual what was it? The actual budget instead of the increase, the available increase. Is that how it worked? Now I'm getting myself confused. But the way that they've done it gives those locals a lot of wiggle room. So
It's
it
very
could be a
flexible.
lot worse.
And there's local leaders who have come out for it too. Mayor Bachensky in Grand Forks has come out for it. In fact, City Council, Grand Forks City Council President Dana Sandy. I don't know if the two have talked to each other. I talked to Sandy, and he said the same thing. I mean, his quote to me was, "If they can't live within this cap, something's wrong." It's a very generous cap, and that is the one thing that worries me about the governor's plan is the cap is so flexible. Locals are still going to be able to raise property taxes and outpace the growth of his, because that's what he does. He sets a snowball rolling down the hill for that tax credit to slowly buy up everybody's property tax bill with the legacy fund, and then caps the snowball that's local spending to hopefully slow it so that the spending snowball rolls down the hill slower than the tax credit snowball.
Yeah.
And what we really have to make sure is that cap is strong enough so that those snowballs roll down the hill at the right speed. I hope I didn't just confuse everybody more with all my talk about snowballs, but I
I
think
know you're in charge of the PR plan now because I could visualize those snowballs and it's perfect.
yeah.
Yep. You want them to catch up to one another and then just roll at
Right.
the speed.
But you want spending to be behind. You want spending to be rolling down the hill slower than the credit. And then eventually the credit hopefully gets to a point where nobody's paying any property tax. And then we still need to, control local spending. But it's a very flexible. I do worry it's maybe a little too flexible. I might even go a little more draconian, but I think I don't want to put words in the governor's mouth. And I don't have any. My impression is maybe he was afraid of the politics when you see the locals come out swinging about taxes and everything else. But I did find it funny, like they're complaining about, well, the state hasn't taxed their spending. Okay, 26% of the state's general fund spending is bailing out your guys' spending. So, if we look back at where all the spending, well, not all the spending increases, but a not small, insignificant percentage of the spending increases in the general fund over the last decade is the state trying to buy down property taxes. It hasn't worked. We got to try. As the governor said, we got to try something new.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Yes, we'll put a pin in it there. I know that's your favorite phrase.
Oh, yeah, woo-hoo, there we are, a pin in it.
We are. We're going to put a pin in it there. Thank you so much for listening. As always, coming up later this week, we were going to have Representative Mike Nathy on the show to talk about his bill because we haven't interviewed him. We interviewed the governor, but Representative Nathy has the bill that's carrying the governor's plan. But apparently he had a scheduling conflict. So I don't know who to tell you is going to be on the show.
Ooh, the mystery guest.
You're just going to have to tune in and find out. Or if you follow our social media, sometimes when we remember, we put up an image about who's coming up next. But all right, well, that's it. So thank you so much for listening. We'll talk again. That's it for today on Plain Talk, the voice of North Dakota politics. Plain Talk is a production of Forum Communications Company. Got a question, comment, or suggestion? Leave us a voicemail or send us a text message at 701-587-3141. That's 701-587-3141. If you haven't subscribed to Plain Talk yet, you can find us on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform like Spotify or Apple Podcasts. For those of you who are already hooked, give us a rating or review. And don't forget to share or tell a friend. Special thanks to my co-host Chad Oban, and from myself and everyone at Plain Talk, thanks for listening. I think they're activists. That's not a bad thing to be.